These are all the choppers I built and loved and the experiences I had with them in the years that I owned and operated Y Chrome Customs. The next order came from a guy in Wisconsin who'd seen my ad, I think in DuPont Registry or something, and he wanted something very similar to the Jack's Ripper, even the Candy Apple Red, so I used the same paints, but did a little bit different design where it was more of like a skull in the tank and then some flames elsewhere on it. We used different wheels. They were, I think that one had the Wrath wheel, still used a 127 inch, so it was very similar. In fact, it was similar enough that the owner of the Jack's Ripper kind of got mad at me because he wanted to have the only bike like that. And even though it was unique, now there was one up in Wisconsin that was more similar to his than he liked. So that's, unfortunately part of the business and the art aspect you have to get used to. But I never actually met the guy in Wisconsin. I would sit on the bike, I would hold handlebars and say, how do you want it to feel? Made sure his height was similar to my height. And it actually worked really well to be able to finish it all like that, ship him the bike, and he was happy with it. Everything seemed to work well. Kind of my first experience being able to do something over the internet, and never even meet the customer that's giving you thousands of dollars for this machine. The next bike, the Stripper, was the first shop bike that I'd built since the hard ass. I'd been keeping really busy with orders, which is a good thing, but I wanted to build something as a shop bike where I could try some new stuff, new looks, and use myself as a guinea pig to ride it to see how I liked it. I started with a War Eagle frame that wasn't down as low as a Pro Street, it wasn't as stretched up as a Shredder, it's kind of in between, but it had kind of a cool look, and I made it stripped down, hence Stripper. My buddy T-Roy made a really cool Stingray seat for it, and he also mixed up what he called the purest red possible. So he laid down the base red coat for me, and then I put on the Stripper graphics on the tank, and it's kind of, being still kind of learning with the airbrush, you have to kind of think about, well, what's a Stripper, what color is it, right? And so I thought, okay, skin starts out as pink, which is red and white, but she needs a tan, so we need to put a little bit of tangerine candy on it, and then a little bit of root beer for kind of the brown tan and the shading and stuff. It came out pretty well, I was happy with it. But the only real paint was the frame and the tank and the little tail section. So instead of using a front fender, I just had this little kind of fork brace on there. Instead of a rear fender, I just fabbed in this little tail section that went off the frame and kind of made a pocket for that Stingray seat. The most unique thing about that bike were the handlebars. Instead of the standard risers and bars or a traditional one that I made, that one I made the Y bars for. And it was kind of different. I made a sort of a mold or whatever you want to say, a tool of wood so that I could heat up the bar and bend it to make this arc. And I used that same tool to make the arced pieces that went to the tail section. But your fingers ended up almost with your thumbs downward and in, instead of like a lot of choppers, you're either straight across or your pinky is down lower. This one, they actually came in, and it was funny to watch people just walk by the bike and look at it and cock their head and kind of imagine what it was like to ride it. It wasn't as bad as you think. I did ride it from Jack's to Lauderdale that way. At some point, I think I had a weld come loose in the mounts, so I ended up putting just high risers and drag bars. When I finally sold the bike, the guy insisted that I put the old bars back on with the Y bars, because to him that's what made the bike. He also had a 124-inch S&S. I built the Stripper with an 80-inch Harley Davidson engine just to keep costs down and a 5-speed transmission. So he shipped me his 124 S&S. I changed the motors out, and I put on the BDL with the outer bearing for a little bit more support since it was a bigger engine, and put it all there. And I tell you what, that thing went like a motherfucker when I got it all put together. I hated to get rid of it. I did have some bad luck on that bike. One night, going down Atlantic Boulevard toward Bourbon Street Bar that used to be, I was going in the right lane. I didn't have mirrors on the bike yet. It wasn't registered or anything. And as I'm going down the road, I see this Ford Ranger come up to a stop sign, and I thought, okay, I better start braking now. Well, I swore the woman driving it looked right at me as she stopped, saw me, so I got off the brake, and at the last second, like she did it on purpose, she comes out in front of me. Now, I couldn't get over a lane because I didn't have mirrors and I didn't know if I'd get right in the way of another car. So I had to kind of thread the needle between the front of her truck and the white line. And as I did that, my leg got crushed down here between the air cleaner and her front bumper. In fact, it tore the bumper off the Ford Ranger. And so I pulled over, she pulls over, she's crying, gives me insurance information and stuff. I didn't have insurance at the time because I was just working in my shop. So I ended up just going to the bar, having a few painkillers, and head back home. And I lived around for about a month. Then I went to call her and say, hey, why don't you give me $100, for the air cleaner, because that's really all that broke is it smashed the air cleaner in there. Figured that was fair. She told me to call her insurance because I'd broken her $5 bumper with my leg. So I called her insurance. The guy says, obviously it's her fault. How much money do you want? I said, how about 50 grand? He said, I'll give you 2,200. Sold. So should have done that every month. I would have been better off financially. The other misfortune I had with that bike was when I went down to Bike Week that year, I was riding into town and I got a ticket because there's no plate on it. It wasn't registered. And the cop said, technically I should put you in jail and I should impound the bike. He ended up letting me go and even told me kind of take these back roads into where you're going so that you don't get pulled over again. So I had the ticket, took off. The next day, meet some buddies there, and they kind of talked me into, it's my fault, right? Borrowing a paper tag from one of the other bikes at the show out at the track, taping it to my chopper. And so we're riding over by the broken spoke and that. And there's a bunch of cops standing there. So one guy stops me, flags me over right there, and he said, that plate back there says green, that this is very clearly a red chopper. And I said, yeah, I kind of borrowed that tag from the track. And he said, between that and these loud ass pipes, you don't have any mirrors, those handlebars, he said, I should give you a ticket right now. So I reached in my pocket, pulled out the ticket from the night before, and I said, you mean like this one from last night? And he says, get the fuck out of here, don't let me see you again. So it's kind of a yes sir, I'm out of here. So went back to the track. The other thing that was unique to the stripper is it was the first one where I did a lot of blacked out accessories instead of chrome everything. So the wheels were blacked out. The engine was actually silver, because like I said, it was a Harley engine, until the 124 went in, which was black with polished fins. All the little white chrome accessories were blacked out, and even the exhaust pipes, we blacked those out as well. And then the seat had that Stingray black seat on it. The handlebars were also blacked out like we'd done on the Stray Cat. And I found that I really kind of liked that look. It seemed like if you had a darker paint like the candy apple red, then it looked better with chrome polished everything else. If you had a bright color like an orange or a red, it seemed like it went better to be against the black background accents, just because it seemed like it was more contrast. And that's one of the unique things about when you're building choppers. You have to be technically competent to make something that people are going to ride down the road and safe and performs well. But you also have to be somewhat of an artist, because you want it to look good when it's done, or nobody's going to want it either. The next chopper we called the Time Killer. The owner of that bike was my old college roommate, and he always had all these skulls everywhere and t-shirts, and there's one I remember that said, time waits for no one. So he wanted something a little bit darker, gothic looking. So I went with a flat black paint job on it. I put a stopwatch on the tank that showed like the Grim Reaper smashing the glass, and then on the back it was like the Reaper's eye looking through the frame of the stopwatch. Like most of my bikes, I cut the tail of the fenders and the add-on little part to the tank to all match and be a consistent design. With the flat black paint sort of establishing the look of the bike, for all the accessories, we did a silver instead of a chrome. And that was the first bike that had the Y-chrome design wheels. You can see these custom wheels. I designed a little accent on it with a blade edge, and then it had the holes in there for lightening the look and the wheel. These wheels were also the first split hub design I'd done, where we had a brake rotor and sprocket both on one side, so you had one clean or show side of the wheel as well. The hardest part about building that bike was the tail section. He wanted a 2-up seat, which I hadn't done on one of these War Eagle frames before. So I kind of framed out the seat pan, made that the way I wanted, but then I had to fab in these amoeba-shaped pieces that would sort of blend from the rear fender up to the actual seat. And once I got one side done and perfect, then obviously I had to mirror that to the other side. And it's one of those things that either it's perfect or it's shit, so you have to spend the time doing it right. Very happy with how it came out. He wasn't big on speed, it was his first bike, so we just went with the 80-inch Harley engine for that, and I think a 5-speed train. And for contrast, we used brown material on the seat instead of black, just to make it pop a little bit. I was working on a bike when I closed the shop in Florida and moved back to Texas, so I had to pass that bike on to another local shop to finish for that customer. That thing was unique in that it was the first time I tried using a twin cam in a frame. It was another War Eagle frame, but because it was a twin cam, there's just an adapter plate you had to put on the back. It wasn't that big of a deal, but that was the kind of unique aspect of that bike. Once getting back to Texas, I decided I wanted one more chopper kind of for myself. And so I started building this one, the Gripper. A little bit different in that it was the first 300 rear that I built, and that also meant it was going to be a right side drive. This bike also had the split hub rear, and it was done in a War Eagle Pro Street Wrath frame, so it has more curvature to the down tubes and that. It's pretty extreme. I think it's over 45 degrees of rake total between the neck and the rake in the trees, and you have to do, that's one lesson I learned early, is you have to make sure you get all that geometry right to measure your rake and trail and everything. If you don't get that right, it's not going to handle properly, and that's not safe in the least. So all that was figured out. I got my Fat Cat's tank on it. For the drivetrain, I ended up using a 121 TP Engineering. First TP engine I'd used, love it. I also got the transmission from them and kind of a package deal that had Jim's gears in their case. And then for the belt drive, instead of the BELs I'd been using, I went with a Primo one for this. The pipes, this was the first that I'd used these. They were a Frankie Serrano design. A little bit different than the MGSs I'd used before on a lot of the choppers. I found some bars that gave me a good fit that kind of was like a shoulder height while sitting down. Not the skinny 21-inch, but a little bit fatter one with the appropriate fender and the big 6-piston PM front caliper on it. It obviously has chrome all over the place with my white chrome custom accessories, and you'll notice that for this one I even did a chrome frame, which I actually really like the way that came out. It's a nice contrast, as I said earlier, to the darker greens. For the paint, I painted them all with a black primer. I used white to put some graphics, ghost graphics in it with like a Grim Reaper on the tank, and then it turns into an hourglass and a girl's ass, basically, rear view. And then covered the whole thing in teal candy. Then for accents on the front fender and on the tank, I used a lime time green to put in some realistic fire. And then I used a little bit of pagan gold just to highlight, give it more of that 3D effect on the fire. This one has a really low seat. So the oil bag that would have came with the frame was, maybe 2.5 quarts. It was pretty small and it would have sat right under it. Being that this is a big engine and it is Texas, it's going to be hot, I ended up getting a 4-quart Moon oil bag and mounted it up front by just welding some mount tabs to the frame. That way it keeps it out here in the airflow, getting nice, fresh, cool air instead of being behind the hot engine. I couldn't get the carb to run decent right off the bat, and I ended up putting in some flexible baffles into the pipes, and I sent the carb away and had a XXX circuit put in it. So they add another circuit, another jet inside, and it gets really shitty mileage now, but it does go like hell. It's very fast for a chopper. I rode this from San Antonio to Daytona Beach. Took several days to do it. Stopped in like Houston and New Orleans and Jacksonville for Biketoberfest one year. And on the way, the pipe, one of them, I didn't have the internal baffle bolted down, and I think it just vibrated and shook against there and cut my pipe, or broke the pipe. What I learned painfully about comfort for this thing is it looks cool. I love that low seat. because of the way it sits, when you're sitting on it, you have to keep constant tension inward on your legs. If you don't, your feet will slide off the pegs, and that's not good. You can't ride with your feet back behind you because of the way those pipes sit. And so there's only real one way to sit, and it's not the most comfortable. But, you know, choppers aren't made for comfort necessarily either. They're made to go fast from bar to bar. And this one does a great job at that. When we got to the gas station in Jacksonville, the bike wouldn't start again. So had to get a tow truck with a setup long enough to handle this monster of a bike. Took it to my buddy's place. The next day I went down to Daytona and I bought a new battery and a new starter, I think, and a starter switch and something else maybe. Put it all back together, did this all in his garage, sweating like hell. Got it, thought everything was good. Well, coming back from Daytona Beach a couple days later through Jacksonville again, it turned out it wouldn't start again. So me and my buddy, he had his night train. We basically had to rent a truck from U-Haul. Since we had two bikes, I had to go to Home Depot, drill holes in the floor of that U-Haul truck to be able to bolt down both bikes with the straps and keep them both in there solid and safe for the ride home. So we ended up, got back, turned out, I changed the regulator, that still wasn't it. It actually turned out to be the alternator on the other side. So that was the Gremlin, but the kind of stuff happens when you're riding choppers. It's not like we make and test a million of these things. Each one you're basically riding a working prototype. But the bike has been very well received. I think it got like a 4th place trophy at Rat's Hole in Daytona Beach. But I also knew this was the only one of the top 4 bikes that was actually ridden there of any kind of distance, not hauled on a trailer, so I was okay with that. I did get the 1st place Pro Builders trophy at the Austin Motorcycle Rally that year as well. It's definitely my best work. And even with that, I missed the mark on comfort. So building choppers has definitely been a learning experience, but the important thing is I'm growing as I do it, and each one is better than the last. And at the end of the day, I'm proud to be able to ride something that I built with these 2 hands, didn't just go down to the dealership and buy.
Subscribe to my YouTube channel below and let's celebrate turning fuel and air into adrenaline.